Welcome to the Jay Martin Show, where we dissect the greatest minds in geopolitics and finance. My guest today is Ronan Wordsworth, and we go deep into U.S. and China tensions. We cover the South Pacific and the tensions with Taiwan. And Ronan's take on this actually really surprised me when I grilled him about what he believes the outcome will be for the future of the people of Taiwan. His answer surprised me, but I feel like he defended his argument very, very well. And I think it's going to surprise you too. So I'd love to know what you think in the comments. We also spent a sufficient amount of time discussing the battle that nobody is talking about, which is the battle for Africa. Now, China has been very active on the continent since 2006, building trade infrastructure in exchange for access to key minerals. United States has become increasingly active, and now countries all over the world are flooding to the continent to build their positions. The UAE is now the fourth largest investor on the continent. Countries all throughout Europe, but Turkey, Iran, Russia, of course, all very active in either trading arms for access to resources or straight investment dollars on the continent. And this is the next frontier in terms of resource supply. So like it or not, this is occurring right now. And I think the consequences of the battle for Africa will be felt for the next decade plus, definitely. And we go deep into this one. Ronan's take was exceptional. He's very well versed in the nuance and conflicts that are happening on the ground through Central Africa, West Africa, East Africa, and the Sahel region. So banger of an episode. Really, really great. I know you're going to enjoy this. So here is Ronan Wordsworth.
This is Jay Martin.
Ronan, it's great to have you on the show. Thanks so much for making the time.
Thanks very much for having me, Jay. I look forward to our conversation.
Yeah, well, me too, because you've got a lot of cool boots on the ground experience with the parts of the globe I want to talk about today. So I want to discuss China-U.S. competitiveness, but where I want to start is on the continent that I think holds the most leverage today, and that's Africa and obviously certain areas within that continent. And you've been covering, to a great extent, China's investment and lending activities across the continent and how they've changed over time. Let's start with that. What's been occurring since like 2006 to 2016, and then after that in terms of Chinese investment trends on the continent, and then I'm going to pull on some threads.
Absolutely, yeah. So as you said, if we go back 15, 20 years, that's when China sort of started making their move towards Africa, but it was sort of ramped up in terms of this investment. Obviously, there was a lot of noise made around BRI, the Belt and Road Initiative, and how that was their tool, their lever for actually getting into the African market. And they sort of used this in a lot of different contexts to get access to the raw mineral resources, be that cobalt, lithium, graphite, all sorts of different things which are vital for green energy transition. But then I would say around 2016, partially because of their own internal economic instabilities, they'd already loaned out a lot of money to Africa, and countries weren't necessarily able to repay these loans. We saw a few countries defaulting, but other countries in a lot of debt distress and asking to renegotiate terms and things like this. They sort of scaled back their lending massively. And to a point where in 2020, 2021, there was almost zero lending from China to the continent whatsoever. And part of this, I think, was because they also realized that once they secured long-term access to these mining sites, they didn't really need to keep up the same level of engagement with the infrastructure and this sort of situation that they had been previously in the first place to get the access. So this became a much cheaper option. Basically, they could have like some sort of personal relationships with the governments and this sort of thing, but not necessarily need to invest in the same way. I would argue maybe in the last 12 months, we've seen that potentially start to ramp back up again. We've seen the China Africa Forum just last month, but basically where they've been in a lot of discussions to start loaning out money again. I think there was some research done which shows last year 2023 was the first time it's ramped back up again. I think this is partially because of the increased competition which we see moving into the Africa marketplace, and so that they don't necessarily have this locked-in dominant position that they once had.
Okay, so if I were to recap that, so 2006 through to 2016, rapidly ramping up investment into, and like we're talking like West Africa, Central Africa, the Sahel region. Would those be the key regions? What were the key regions of investment?
Even East Africa. So if we look at,
Mhm.
say, Kenya, Tanzania,
That's right.
both of them had significant Chinese investment. But then in West Africa, as you said, there's a lot of Chinese investment in Nigeria,
Mm.
around the Cape there. And then down in Angola was the single biggest recipient of Chinese investment money. But then Central Africa as well. If we look at Zambia, Democratic Republic of Congo, both of those took out significant Chinese loans and have had a lot of Chinese investment in terms of infrastructure as well. I mean, I've been to Zambia, and all you see around the country there is Chinese construction companies building the infrastructure up
Mm.
until a few years ago, where the new president came in and looked to break away from some of this relationship because of the debt distress the country was then in, I think. So they kind of did a bit of a scattergun approach across the whole continent. I mean, the East African countries might not have the same mineral resources, but if we look at terms of Tanzania and Kenya, they're extremely important hubs to be able to then access the shipping lanes to the Chinese mainland to be able to bring back these raw mineral resources.
Right, right. Okay, okay. And so, so investment began to cease a little bit around 2016 because there was no competition. They'd laid the infrastructure. And just to recap, this infrastructure, this investment was geared towards accessing resources first and foremost. I mean, infrastructure deals, rail deals, transport deals, all of this with the goal of gaining access to the key metals and resources that are beneath the surface in Africa, making the Chinese economy more competitive. This investment began to peter out because there weren't any other countries really competing for this access. And so when there's no competition, there's no urgency. In addition, the Chinese economy began to slow, so less money to lend and invest in the continent. And then third, some of these loans weren't getting repaid, maybe government corruption, maybe mismanagement, who knows, but you can only do so many bad debt deals before you start slowing them down. Now, however, there is competition, and we're seeing the U.S. become very active on the continent. We're seeing certain countries in the Middle East become very active on the continent. I think the UAE is like the third or fourth largest lender investor right now in Africa. And as you mentioned, China is scaling back up again as well. So what's changed and why is the spotlight now? And break down, if you could, like, if you know, the key investors, lenders in Africa right now. Is it still China, US, and then a few trailing, or what's that look like?
Yeah, so as you said, like obviously China is ramping back up, but then the US is now, I would say, just since basically December 2022, only a little under 2 years ago, put a renewed focus on their investment within Africa. And for the specific goal, I would say, partially of partnering with African countries in development and then keeping out Russia and Chinese money coming in. And then secondly, to secure long-term access to some of these resources, which are going to be vital for things such as electric car batteries. I mean, DRC is a great example of this because if you look at cobalt itself, I think DRC has about 65% of the world's proven cobalt reserves. And prior to this, or the current situation is basically 98% of that goes to China.
Right.
So, and that's reflected then in the dominant position of China as a manufacturer of electric cars and of the batteries that go in those cars. And so this is part of, I guess, the critical mineral strategy of the US, but then also the EU are looking to do something similar and in some ways work with the US to do that. So I think if we look at one particular example, the flagship project, I guess, of this renewed engagement is the Lobito Corridor, which goes from the west coast in Angola, basically a port there, heading inland almost 2,000 kilometers to Zambia and to DRC, and it's basically upgrading an existing rail network, modernizing it, and then using that to turn into both passenger transport, but then also obviously resource transport to the west coast of Africa. So then it can actually be more easily traded with Europe and with the US. And this is for the main goal of securing their own supply chain lines into the future. And then to look at some of the middle powers that are really making it a move into Africa. As you said, UAE is a massive one. They've been heavily involved in the gold trade for a long time, where that's from, we see Rwanda, Zimbabwe, for instance. A lot of the maybe more shady gold goes through UAE, but then also legitimate gold also goes into the Emirates there. But the main sector which they invest in terms of infrastructure is ports. We see, I think, around 25 to 30 ports are owned or managed by UAE groups now across Africa. So they've made a real big push specifically into that domain and trying to control those shipping lines. And then just to touch on a few other actors, which are obviously starting to move in. We've seen Saudi as part of their PID, the investment fund, the PIF, sorry, the Public Investment Fund. They've looked to bring on board some African projects to be able to, again, get access to mineral resources. Turkey also has specific areas where they target, whether that's in the Sahel, but then also Somalia, Ethiopia, around the Horn there. They have these close ties with those countries, and they've made some deals with, say, Somalia now in terms of exchanging defense equipment, troops on the ground and training for access to oil fields off the coast of Somalia in these territorial waters around the Horn of Africa there, which are basically untapped completely at the moment. And then Iran, obviously, they haven't got the same ability to invest as some of these other countries. What they can offer is arms and drones. If we see, that's usually why countries that choose to go that route don't have many other options. So you look at the Sahelian countries that have basically had the military coups in the last 2 years, Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, they might tend to look towards Iran and Russia for security assistance. And so just to touch on Russia, because I think that's elephant in the room, I think they don't really invest in terms of infrastructure or financial economic ways. However, what they do is then provide security security to a specific group of people vis-a-vis the government or the ruling party and their close inner circle, and do that in exchange for then access to the mineral sites, where that's gold mines, diamond mines, and really are only interested in locking down those specific sites and securing those specific sites from potential militant insurgencies or different insurgent groups across the country. So that's a bit of a background to the different. There's obviously a lot of different actors there, but they all have different motivations. And
That's okay. That's great, Ronan. Thank you so much. I'm going to recap it one more time from the beginning, just to really make sure I'm painting the picture. And what I mean by that is understanding the picture myself clearly. From 2006 forward, China made a big move into Africa. Well, the rest of the world really slept on this, right? And they gained a massive advantage and kind of a first mover's advantage in terms of accessing key resources, owning the infrastructure to transport those resources, and all of this. More recently, the rest of the world has woken up, probably because we're entering a stark shortage of most of the commodities, the hard commodities that the world needs to fuel the green energy future we've all been promised. There's been massive underinvestment in raw materials for the last 15 years. So now there's a bit of a rush, and my audience is familiar with this rush towards commodity investment, because we need to secure the supply of all of the ingredients of infrastructure, whether it's copper, nickel, lithium, gold, silver. We need it, right? Oil and gas. And and we're seeing a lot. So we're seeing now, this is like the next frontier, and countries are flooding in. And you mentioned, yes, EU, UAE, Saudi, Turkey, Iran, Russia, of course. I gotta wonder, you mentioned this. This is the interesting segue. There was this epidemic of coups since like 2020 in the Sahel region, like 9 military coups that overthrew governments. And I think another 4 failed attempts. Like that's a lot. That's a lot of synchronicity, right, to occur all at once when you suddenly have the world descending on this region, competing for power and influence. And I got to think those two things are related. You don't have all the major players show up on the chessboard and suddenly pieces begin flipping left, right, and center. during that same time period. So are those two things, can we connect those dots as the world shows up to compete for access to Africa? Governments begin getting overturned in very large number. What do you think?
I would say it's got some level of relationship there. If we look specifically, I think most of the countries that have had coups are part of Francophone Africa.
Yeah.
And so there's some
right.
underlying reasons in a lot of those countries where there's this maybe disenfranchisement with the current relationship between, or the current relationship at the time before the coup between the government and France. And we saw that like with a lot of French companies still having prominent positions within the countries, whether that's in key sectors such as communications, transport, even within the energy sector, be that mining or different things like this. Then with the military, often these governments were very closely supported by French military, French training, and then the political sphere. So what I mean by that is we had a lot of these people that were overthrown in coups were in power for decades. And
Right.
all they needed to have was some veneer of legitimacy by holding elections, even if they were not legitimate elections. And then if they declared that they won, they would still be supported by France. So I think a lot of the commonality is there. And then the reason we saw this specifically in the Sahel, I think, was a lot of it was pushed, this sentiment was pushed by Russia through different channels. Obviously, Russia's been present in Africa in its new form, specifically through Wagner Group since about 2017, starting in Central African Republic. And then we saw even there, that's where they sort of did this testing ground of tapping into this anti-French sentiment and then utilizing that to turn the population against the governments and overthrow the incumbent governments who maybe had close ties to Paris. And I think specifically with the three countries which are now very closely tied to Russia and left ECOWAS, that Niger, Burkina Faso, Mali, I think those are three where you see this played out the most. Basically, they were able to use social media, use traditional media, undermine French legitimacy, but then also paint the picture to the military juntas who seized power, painted the picture of insecurity that only they could fix, that the French troops that were there were not fixing the situation, which does have some truth to it. I mean, they had insurgencies ongoing for a decade, and 10 billion euros was spent by the EU fighting these insurgencies in those specific G5 countries, and still they were ongoing. They weren't able to eradicate it completely. What I would argue, though, is if we look now, the situation's actually much worse than it was prior to that, and these military leaders that came in on the promise of increasing security have actually done the opposite. We see Burkina Faso, for instance, lost half of its territory to militant Islamic extremist groups and is the number one hotbed for terrorist attacks in the world right now, overtaking Afghanistan. So I think the results might bear out differently, but I think that's the underlying reason that we saw this wave of coups sweep across in the last 5 years.
Okay, that makes sense. So yes, definitely some international players meddling, but also, and probably more importantly, kind of a failure of faux democracy, right? And like President Ali Bongo, I think that was Gabon, like great example. Democratically elected leader, but his family's been in power for 55 years. So how democratic is this really, And, I read a stat somewhere recently prepping for this that 26 out of 30 African countries now are experiencing a decreased, I guess, appreciation for democracy, or they're beginning to value it less because their life experience tells them it doesn't actually work and it doesn't matter and it's fake. Which, I mean, if you're a citizen of Gabon, that's been the case, right? Like that's been your entire lived experience.
Exactly.
Now, another trend that I've read you cover has been, I don't know if this is a trend or not, so I'll preface it there. Led by China. Now we're not just seeing investment into infrastructure and trade, but into military and security competency. They're, I think, even bringing soldiers and officers to China to train them and then fly them back. And then you mentioned, Iran and Russia supplying more arms than money. And so are you seeing a bit of a pivot, or at least in addition to infrastructure now, military investment, which would mark a bit of a shift in the aggressive nature of how countries are competing for access? What do you think?
Absolutely, yeah, for sure. Like as you mentioned, there's a few good examples, but then Turkey is kind of doing the same thing in Somalia, and they were in direct competition with the UAE, who were funding a lot of the Somali armed forces and doing a lot of the training there, and then were basically replaced by Turkish troops. So I think this is definitely a big trend, which I would say is partially because of the success of Wagner Group, which obviously don't exist under that name anymore, but I'm sure people know that now called the Africa Corps, and basically operate under the Russian Ministry of Defense.
And just to make sure I get that, because Wagner Group, now infamous Wagner Group, we saw the almost coup in Russia, made headlines. Now, yes, they're sort of rebranded as Africa Corp. And as I understand, effectively making their way around the Sahel region, offering like regime protection plans. It sounds like an insurance policy against a military coup, but is that more or less what it is?
That is pretty much exactly what it is, I would say, in exchange for access to the resources and the
Yes.
mining sites.
Nothing's free. Yeah.
Not only, I would say, in those Sahel countries, but if we look north to Libya, for instance, and Sudan, where there's two ongoing, I guess the Libya one's not a hot war going on, but there's still like this ongoing conflict between the government forces in Tripoli and then General Haftar's forces in Benghazi and the east of the country, and then Sudan, where we have the two rival factions, the RSF and the Sudan Armed Forces, battling for control of the country. Interestingly, Russia's actually kind of supporting both sides in these instances, whether that's just mostly through weapons provision, but then, as you say, also through security, training for troops and this sort of stuff. And I would say it's very successful for them as a model in Africa. So they've demonstrated this as a very viable option. I think we've seen a few small Turkish mercenary groups pop up in Africa trying to offer some sort of similar service. But I think Wagner is so well established now. And as yet, I'll keep calling it Wagner because all the change is basically who's paying their paycheck, I would say. Okay. I think Prigozhin obviously died in the plane crash last year, or crash, I use in inverted commas, but he died there. And I was someone that thought maybe that would be a cause for a breakup in the way that Wagner operates, because a lot of the relationships were built on his personal relations with the leader of the countries. However, I think Russia was very good at holding on to these ties and then basically just incorporating Wagner straight into a different arm of the Russian Ministry of Defense, calling it the Africa Corps. They've got a few different names, I think, in different regions in Central African Republic. I think they might be called IW9 now, but they're all the same thing, which is the ex-Wagner forces now operating just under the Russian state umbrella rather than as a private contractor. And as you said, I think they offer this specific service, protection for minerals and access to different financial, economic outputs.
It always comes back to that, in my opinion. We say, you look at conflicts erupting, you try to make sense of the dynamics. Why are they fighting over this piece of territory? What's the history? Who's at play? In investing, we say follow the smart money. In geopolitics, I say the smart money follows commodities, and that's really the truth teller. At the end of the day, trade is the truth teller. I believe that. And that's what all of these countries and all of these participants are jockeying for, is access to the resources, to, the fuel green technology. We hear that a lot, but it's much bigger than that. We just need copper in general. We need nickel in general. I mean, we're running out. So either the lights are going to go off or the price is going to go up, or we're going to find a bunch more somewhere, probably a combination of all of them. And that's what's really at play here. So when we look at this conversation through the lens of global power, and that's a big phrase, but just saying, if you look at the history of power, it usually concentrates around who has access to the stuff that the rest of the world needs, right? That's, largely how power gets passed around the globe. How significant is what's occurring in Africa today? Is this Because I feel like it's very underspoken. I feel like the battle for Africa is the most important thing that's not being discussed by media. Everybody's talking about Ukraine and Israel, and very important, definitely. South Pacific, lots going on. But the battle for Africa seems to me, in terms of access to the ingredients, the power, all of our economies, that's a linchpin and a really, really important one. What's your take?
I agree completely. I think not only we won't necessarily see the results of this in the next 2, 3, 4 years. It's like the next decade or 2 decades or 3 decades down the line where this is actually going to come to the fore, and we see, okay, China's developed this dominant market position because of the groundwork that they did now to secure the access long term to these resources. And so I think that's why we see basically a global realization to this fact that Africa is extremely important, and this new scramble for Africa occurring because of that. I think there's one other quick thing to touch on there is the human demographic aspect as well. I think we see in developed nations generally, whether that's China, Europe, US, any developed nation have problems with population stagnation or declination. In Africa, it's the one continent where that is not true at all. And obviously, these are very underdeveloped countries, but I think there's huge potential in human capital within these countries if you're able to get the state institutions right, whether that's education, health, different aspects like this. Then also that would pay dividends in 20, 30 years' time through the human capital side of it.
Yeah, every developed nation has terrible demographics, but China has awful demographics.
Exactly.
And one solution to that would be co-opting the economies that have favorable demographics, right? Which is largely India and Africa, right? Like that, they're nailing it right now. Really interesting take. Okay, so maybe that's if I were to ask you head to head right now, is it too late for the U.S. to be competitive on this continent? In the last 12 months, we've had the U.S. Africa Summit and the China Africa Summit, right? These things are occurring simultaneously. You know, China had the first movers advantage and a long one, 15, 20 years, but now everyone's getting aggressive. Is the U.S. competitive on this continent? What's your take, Ronan?
It definitely can be. I think the opportunity is not gone at all. I think one of the key aspects of that is not to sell it as a zero-sum game. Basically, the US and China can both operate in the same country. This is how it should be sold to the different governments. We can offer you different things, but we're not saying necessarily we're going to come in and replace all of the Chinese investment that's flowing in. We're going to give you different investment that you need. Speak to the different countries and look at their needs and requirements, and then maybe tailor solutions individually, but then be able to work with them and not necessarily say you have to choose between us and China. I think it doesn't work as well with Russia for sure, because they choose to operate in a completely different space there, and that being working with the military regimes. And I think nobody really wants to work there. Even the Chinese don't operate in those spaces. So I think definitely the opportunity is not lost, and there has been some movements, as you said. The U.S. Africa Summit is ongoing. We've seen a lot more U.S. capital investment in Africa. I think if this continues, both in terms of physical infrastructure, but then in terms of investing in local industries, in local businesses, these sort of things can definitely have a long-term positive impact on being able to secure some sort of favorable relationship with the continent. I think even this can even go back to trade. The US has the AGOA agreement, which includes a lot of African countries, and I think it has more scope to be ramped up and used as a tool for giving this perception of being a good partner to Africa. I think it's not spoken about very much, but this dates back to, I think, 2000 and maybe 2000. I think the AGOA agreement, first just at the end of Bill Clinton's term, has been used by or renewed by each president since then, and it gives favorable market access for African countries to the US market. But then it's about selling that and saying, like, this is one of the benefits that you get from being a partner of the US as well. I think that's not very well sold. China obviously has this very big aura about being a great partner for Africa.
Right.
And the US maybe doesn't have that same PR.
Yeah.
They're
Yeah.
that's part of the problem as well. So I think definitely it's not too late. There's different steps which can be done to sort of maybe level the playing field or get a better foothold on the continent for sure.
And also, to a degree, the United States has a lot more barriers of entry to get a deal done, do they not? Because they need to consider the human rights record of the country, the humanitarian record of the country, whereas China doesn't so much, you know? And who was it? Was it Lula da Silva? I can't recall. They made this hilarious comment. Look, when the president of China comes to visit, I get a bridge. When the president of America comes to visit, I get a lecture, you know, and that kind of sums up some of the criteria that we have to go through in the West because a sitting American president couldn't do a deal with a completely corrupt nation, or at least they'd do their best to, you know how it is. And whereas China doesn't have that barrier to entry, they can just do the deal. It doesn't matter so much. That's how I understand it. Is that accurate, or what do you think?
I 100% agree. That's been a big barrier to entry for sure. I think part of it should go back to being more pragmatic, potentially for the US, for Europe, to that relationship. You got to look at the context which these countries are operating in. When they're a dictator by our terms, they still might be a better alternative than what we see in the country next door, for instance. I think a good example of that is Rwanda. Nobody would argue that they're a truly democratic country. I don't think Paul Kagame cracks down on dissident voices in the country. However, some pragmatism in working with them would go a long way because he's able to produce long-term development results. And so then you say, okay, what's more important? It's a difficult balancing act for sure. And there's some red lines which the US would have, which I would probably agree with, such as not working with these military juntas in supplying them with arms, for instance, which is the reason why they got expelled from Niger, for instance. But then in the other relationships, I think some sort of pragmatism has to come into play as well.
Yeah. Okay. Now, I mean, you lived and worked in Zimbabwe, you know, for years. Talk to me about just last question on Africa. Then I want to pivot to the South Pacific, but you know, talk to me just about the efficiency of working in Zimbabwe as an engineer, Ronan.
That's a funny question because I think it couldn't be more inefficient if it tried, I would say. It was very difficult. I worked for a very, very good company. I would say the best in Zimbabwe, one of the best in Africa, I would guess. And we constantly had problems with things such as hyperinflation, with access to the things to make the roads, for instance, because I was working on building highways. And then you're working for the government and you're trying to get paid every month, and they've got no money, or because of the corruption, the hyperinflation is going on. So you're constantly having this battle to try and get more money to be able to get paid fair value for what you do. Right. And it brings in so much inefficiencies in the actual process. And you see that play out, I would say, in the human capital 100%, where for people to be able to be successful, you have to be really, really lucky and dedicated. Whereas I would say, obviously, coming from Australia, I got to my position, I would say, somewhat because of hard work, but then also because of the situation I was born into, being in a developed country and giving you that opportunity. And so the amount of inefficiency that comes out of this lack of function of state institutions is humongous. It can't be overstated enough, I think. And then not only that, big problem in Zimbabwe, also across the continent, but I think is the power generation, which impacts all businesses. Not being able to produce enough electricity, obviously, then things such as refineries, these sort of things can't run. Zimbabwe doesn't have any major functional industries anymore. South Africa was having the same issues. We saw its GDP massively declining over the last decade, and then since the start of this year, basically start to pick up again. Because of privatization of the energy market. And this privatization then gave opportunities to develop the industries that go with that, because you can access these basic things which we take for granted, I guess, such as energy, such as not having hyperinflation, such as having access to water, basic things.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for that. Now I want to pivot to the South Pacific a little bit, but here's what we'll do as a segue. We talked about the decreased for a period of time Chinese investment in Africa because their economy was struggling, and it still is, and they're trying to find a solution to this. And last year, President Xi was in San Francisco speaking to a large gathering of American business leaders trying to inspire foreign direct investment to return to China. It had largely evaporated. I'd say now we could say that meeting was largely unsuccessful. If you think I'm wrong, love to know your thoughts there. But FDI in China, foreign direct investment from American businesses into China, has not increased. As a consequence, no shocker, we're seeing the early stages of the stimulus bazooka being fired in Beijing, right? And massive stimulus packages like we haven't seen in 16 years in that country. And it's not just decreasing the interest rates and the reserve ratio requirements for banks. It's dropping down payments on new home purchases down to 15%, knocking 50 basis points off the mortgage rates, but also a lot of funding going direct to regional governments, direct subsidies, and direct to consumers. And it's kind of like a cash for clunkers business. It's like $1 trillion going to consumers to incentivize them to sell their appliances and buy new ones. Just buy stuff. I mean, that's, and buy green technology. That's the argument, right? Which inspires demand for the resources back to that. But, that's what we're seeing. Now, there's a lot of consequence to that headline, I believe. And I think the stimulus in China is just getting started. In 2008, it began as the $4 trillion bazooka. That's what it was called. By the end, it was $9.5 trillion spread over 27 months. There's a lot of room to go here. But I think there's a lot of significance to this. But one of the pieces I want to focus on first is that China needed to stimulate their economy. Had it been stimulated by American businesses investing in China, that would mean that China would have to appease America to a degree to keep that money coming in. But because that's not what happened and they're stimulating their own economy, they can afford to offend whoever they want, right? Because it's their money on the table. And we're seeing this. I don't know if you'd say these things are related, but, Chinese military exercises now flying deeper into Japanese territory, surrounding the Senkaku Islands. And all of my students in the commodity university, you guys are familiar with the Senkaku Islands because we covered this, right? And the history of dispute and how geopolitics directly impacts the supply and demand of key resources because of the Japanese-China disputes in the Senkaku Islands. So thecommodityuniversity.com for anybody who wants to check that out. But you guys know what we're talking about. And then obviously surrounding Taiwan and much, much more. But we're seeing a lot of aggressive military activity that we've never seen before. And I wonder how much of that is related to, well, we're on our own. We gave it, we came hat in hand and received nothing. So now things are going to be done differently. So what's your take on the South Pacific and that dynamic there, Ronan?
I think you probably hit the nail on the head there for sure. If we look, part of the assertiveness is because of the fundamental Chinese imperative is to protect their trade lines. I mean, if we look, their economy is built on consumerism and exports to different markets. And I think part of that is this threat perception that could be blocked in by an assertive US-led partnership with a lot of these countries. I think part of it, as you said, is the Chinese maybe going to look for this FDI, which never came. But then part of it is the different countries which they've been working on to build these partnerships with in the Pacific, then turning against them potentially. Looking specifically at countries such as the Philippines, where China had spent significant resources trying to turn them into a close ally and give them this escape route from the first island chain, so-called first island chain, and mean that they can always maintain these trade routes. And we've seen the Philippines turn drastically towards the US for security, for partnership under the current president. And so I think it's twofold. I think basically this assertive nature is pushback against this feeling of being contained, and then the threat that comes with that to their future trade relationships. If we look starting up at Japan, South Korea, Taiwan, Philippines, and then even countries such as Papua New Guinea, another country which China tried to expend a lot of resource and energy in turning into a close partner. They're also losing out there to Australia and the US.
Mm.
So that's part of it. I think this perceived threat perception at being boxed into a corner. And then secondly, as you said, they have to get finance to their economy in some way. And this is definitely a means of doing that by stimulating, by then being more assertive and looking for other partners in the region potentially that they can use going forward.
And that's part of this military exercise, is it not, to demonstrate to the region we are a worthy military ally. Look at our strength, right? The way they're flooding the South Pacific and South China Sea with military activity.
Definitely. I wouldn't say it's necessarily working. If we look at the results, and more countries are turning away from China. If we saw even Vietnam today, I think just recently signed a new comprehensive bilateral partnership with France. Obviously not the US, but also a US ally. And both Xi and Biden visited Vietnam earlier this year, showing that like this is another country which will come out as another potential battleground for influence between the two.
So that's a good point, because you're right. Regionally, there is a ton of conflict. Obviously, there's been many feuds and violent feuds between Philippine fishermen and Chinese Coast Guard. Same thing with Vietnam, I believe. A lot of Vietnamese fishermen, Chinese Coast Guard disputes and conflicts that turned physical and violent. Malaysia is now drilling in disputed waters. Threading a little fine balance there. If you have any thoughts on that, I'd love to know. And then obviously Japan, we mentioned, they're continuing to encroach into Japanese airspace with their military exercises. And then obviously the big one, Taiwan, right? A huge point of tension. So let's jump into that. One of the biggest questions I get from my audience is essentially what's going to happen to Taiwan, right? What will the outcome of this tension be? A lot of conversation about some kind of a hostile takeover from China. And in that scenario, U.S. has two choices: stand down or get in there, right? What's your take? What's your take on the future of the Taiwanese-China tension, Ronan?
So I don't want to say any too definitive statements based off the last 2 years' experience, but I think, to me, it doesn't make sense for China to actually act on attacking Taiwan. The risk is much too great that A, the US will get involved, B, you're attacking a very, very fortified island where you're exposed all the way across to hit it. It will be very, very difficult for them to be successful in taking it by force. And then the benefits of it is very minor in terms of what it's going to gain for them. Like the Taiwanese people are not going to then welcome them in with open arms if they've just been taken by force. And I think there's this, obviously, strategic ambiguity has been the policy of the US for a long time in regards to Taiwan. But I would say that there is a high likelihood that just that threat hanging over it is enough to deter China. I think they probably were looking at what happened in Ukraine and the level of support that was given to Ukraine as maybe a guide to what would happen there. And I think the support for Taiwan would be much greater than would be given to Ukraine in terms of
you think so?
I would say in terms of physical engagement. Because obviously NATO, despite what Russia says, has got no troops on the ground in active combat in Ukraine. They supply weapons to help Ukraine defend themselves, but they're not actually engaged actively in fighting there. Whereas in Taiwan, I think there would be more of a motivation to do so, not just from the US, but from Japan, from South Korea, these different allies, which don't want to see China become this neighborhood bully that if they first start with Taiwan, what's going to stop them from doing something next? And we've sort of seen this South China Sea expansionism attitude of China be pushed back by all the regional countries. As you said, Malaysia is not happy about it. Philippines, all the regional countries that have interests in the South China Sea have not been happy with the Chinese approach there. And so I think that this would likely act as enough of a deterrence to prevent an attack. But then, as I said, if it was to happen, I think it's more likely that countries would actively get involved in supporting Taiwan than they would in Ukraine.
Fascinating. Okay. So there's a case there to be made that the United States would actually be more active militarily, and allies. You mentioned Japan and probably the Philippines and maybe Vietnam. And who knows, but the regional actors would play a larger and active military role in coming to Taiwan's defense. Is there a scenario where, similar to Hong Kong, China is able to adjust some laws and come up with a legal case? I mean, the history of Taiwan is a stalemated civil war, is it not? There's the People's Republic of China and then the Republic of China. There's a civil war. The Republic of China retreated to the island of Taiwan, and that's where things landed. So in theory, if you're living mainland China, you remember this history, maybe that's what you see. This is and always has been the Chinese island, and this is the stalemate civil war, but that's our territory, and we have a legal obligation to reclaim it. And are there any parallels between Hong Kong and Taiwan, Ronan?
For sure, that's their belief, but I don't agree with it. And because of that, I think it's quite different from the Hong Kong case. If we look at Hong Kong, obviously that was a British colony and then given back to China under agreement with a transition period of 50 years, which then even that got violated. I think the best case scenario for China for some sort of solution would be to have maybe de facto independence of Taiwan as part of a broader China, but then have very close relationship with the mainland. But I think that the ship's kind of sailed, so to speak, on Taiwan willingly becoming part of China again. Mm-hmm. I think we're much too far down the road for that to be any realistic possibility. And so the only way that could come to pass would be through a conflict vis-a-vis China attacking Taiwan, which again is possible. I think it's unlikely, but I won't say anything's impossible these days.
Yeah. Well, and unlikely because of what you just discussed, what you shared on regional powers coming to the defense of Taiwan. That's not what China wants. China doesn't want a hot war in its backyard like that. And
exactly.
And I'm sort of scraping my brain here, but do we have any examples of China overtly invading a neighboring country in modern history?
Not that I can think of either, to be honest. Like the way they operate is not the same as what Russia potentially does, which is put troops on the ground.
Yeah.
China uses more economic means and different tools of influence rather than active fighting combatants. They haven't got huge experience doing that, I think.
Okay, that's sort of aligned with what I was assuming. What's funny is I have had a number of, former CIA agents on this program and really grateful for their time. Elbridge Colby, his book's right here, just finished reading it. He wrote the National Defense Strategy for the White House in 2018, reporting directly to the President of the United States. And all these guys that I've had, they usually share that the biggest thing is China. The biggest threat is China. The biggest conversation is China, Taiwan, and the South Pacific. And that region outweighs anything we're seeing in the Middle East or Europe. And we're all talking about it every day, they say. We're all talking about it every day. And I listen to that and I'm like, that sounds serious. But correct me if I'm wrong. You know what they weren't talking about like 3 or 4 years ago was Russia invading Ukraine. Essentially scoffing at the idea, even as Russian troops lined the border. There's no way Putin's going to avoid Ukraine. That was the narrative we were hearing. They weren't talking about Hamas invading Israel. That didn't come up that I heard. That caught everybody flat-footed. So it's like, the thing that we talk about so much is the least likely thing to surprise us, is it not? And maybe talking about it every day is the deterrence strategy. But what do you think?
100% agree. I would argue that this is definitely still the forefront of U.S. strategic thinking is still all around China. But look, obviously there's been huge support to Ukraine. There's been huge support to Israel. But again, active military engagement, not so much. The focus is still having this tightening security relationships with the Pacific countries, whether that's South Korea, Japan, trilateral relationship. I would argue that even AUKUS is a direct view that China is still the main strategic competitor. Russia is not a real strategic competitor to the US at all in terms of anything other than military, nuclear power, nuclear weapons. That's the only thing that Russia can really use. Again, they can't even beat Ukraine. Obviously, they're not going to take on the US military. Whereas China, the largest military in the world, has the economic, financial might to be able to back that up if there was a war. Vis-a-vis, they are the biggest threat in the strategic planning for US, and that basically echoes what the former CIA agents have said as the strategic thinking for the US, for the White House, for the DoD there, and the Pentagon going forward. And I think that's unlikely to change anytime soon.
So I got to ask this one question because I know my audience is going to. So if I don't, I'll get in trouble. The United States is already spread too thin. We are deploying arms in Europe and the Middle East far faster than we can replenish them. And therefore, our ability to actively engage in a third conflict on the other side of the world is very minimal. We've already depleted ourselves too much. We lack the infrastructure to rebuild fast enough. And I know a lot of pundits were calling I think 12 defense missiles that America used last week in Iran's attack on Israel. And we apparently produced 12 of those missiles per year. We used an annual supply in an evening, So what's your take on that? In America's present day military competency and our ability to engage in a third front?
So if it was to happen, I would say two things. First of all, the US military wise is prepared. Obviously, they're depleting a lot of the reserve stocks, but they still obviously have operational levels of these missiles, of these arms, etc. Second, the US is still the biggest economy in the world, really, in terms of being able to scale industry. And because of this, if there was a need, if there was an active war, the US has proven before that it can mobilize the resources internally through government expenditure, etc., to be able to then ramp up the production. I think also, if that was to happen, we would see support to Ukraine drop significantly from the US, with the discussion with the Europeans that this is your continental problem. You should be doing all of the heavy lifting there. We're more worried about the Pacific Ocean, which can be a threat to our land borders. I mean, for Russia to attack the US, besides using long-range missiles, they have to go through Europe first. So they're not a direct threat to the US in the same way that China could be if they became a dominant naval power. So there, obviously, I understand the concerns, but I do think that the US has the capabilities to be able to negate those things. And of course, this is definitely in the thinking of the key strategic minds in the Pentagon, for instance. Like, they're not going to be giving away supplies that will then leave them exposed in the case of a third war.
Right.
Just look at the number of aircraft carriers that the US has, and there's one deployed in the Middle East now. You could easily mobilize all those battalion groups to the Pacific if they were needed, and the full naval force of the US would come down to bear on the Chinese if there was that invasion, and it would be posing an imminent threat to the US.
Is that the Eisenhower that's in the Middle East right now?
I don't know which one it is. I think it's the Eisenhower.
Yeah. Right.
Yeah.
Right. Okay. Yeah. No, that's a good take. Okay. I appreciate that. A buddy of mine was actually on a cruise going through the Suez Canal, and the Eisenhower was directly in front of their cruise ship. I guess this would have been, 9 months ago, but it took some wild pictures. Wild pictures. What have we missed, Ronan? Around the globe, what else is catching your attention as a point of tension, conflict, significance that maybe people aren't watching as keenly or as accurately as they could?
I just wrote an article, actually, that maybe one thing that's kind of a fun thing, which is the change of maybe drone strategy of the US and of Western countries in the wake of Ukraine-Russia war. The US has obviously long used drones in warfare, but their focus was on things such as the Reaper, such as the Grey Eagle, which are very expensive, reusable drones and will continue to have a massive place in US military. However, there was not necessarily the same appreciation for the functionality and usability of small, cheap drones and using them en masse. And we've seen both Russia and Ukraine prove that these technologies are super cheap to produce and can be very effective if used properly. And that's definitely, I would say, in the minds of military thinkers at the moment, that this is going to be part of the arsenal that was not really thought necessary before the conflict and is now definitely going to be important going forward.
Could I
that's
share?
My
Oh, go ahead, please. Go ahead.
That's my first one. I don't know.
All
I can't
right.
think of anything else off the top of my head now.
Well, on that front, let me share an unpopular opinion that I have. People tend to hate on drone warfare and remote warfare because of how inhumane it is, right? You are in a distant room with a controller and you can target people on the other side of the world in a very, uncompassionate manner. I would argue that maybe this is far better than the, incendiary bombing we used to execute, the sort of blind dropping bombs out of a plane, World War II strategy. Like we used to carpet bomb and just really blindly attack each other and civilian centers to a very large degree. And I understand the inhumane, and I've seen the videos of it's heartbreaking, a soldier running and a drone chasing him. And you're like, whoa, that's a robot chasing a human. I like none of that at all, right? But it's a robot chasing one human very specifically. And it's still heartbreaking, and you wish it wasn't the case. But isn't that a much better option than sort of using our best guess and how we used to attack? I mean, look at the Japan fires and the London Blitz and World War II examples a long time ago. But this just has come a long way, and I'd rather a sniper than a machine gun. No.
Yeah, I would think so. And like the Vietnam War is another example, the same as what you're saying. Like obviously, Laos has still huge amounts of unexploded ordnance to this day from carpet bombing that was kind of indiscriminate and. This, at least, as you say, is more targeted. It might seem more inhumane, but at the end of the day, it doesn't matter which way people die. To put it bluntly, if they're killed by a robot or a bomb that's dropped from a plane, the net result is still the same. I think, as you say, it does take maybe it feels less personal for sure because you're much further detached from the actual.
But if the gross body count is dropping dramatically, shouldn't that be the headline that we're like, look, war's horrific. It should be avoided at all costs. And when it starts, we should end it as quickly as possible. But it's also inevitable in human nature, and it's going to keep happening. And maybe this is oddly a more humane practice. I don't know. Yeah. No one agrees with me on that. I find.
I think it's a fair take, to be honest. I don't disagree at all.
Yeah. Okay. Look, Ronan, where can I push people who want to hear more of your work? I know you have a podcast. You write for Geopolitical Futures, and you're in a few different places. So where can I send people who want to hear more from you?
Yeah, so the podcast is called The Geopolitical Pickle. It's on YouTube and on any podcasting app. I think we've got an upcoming series on Russian disinformation in Africa, which should be quite interesting. I think we interviewed 5 different experts from different aspects, looking at the impacts of that. And then, as you said, Geopolitical Futures, I write there fairly often on South Pacific, on Africa, and the different geopolitical evolutions that are happening in the 2 different theaters. So, and then if you want to follow me, obviously you can find me at Ronan Words on Twitter, I think, or X and Instagram, LinkedIn, whatever platform there.
I appreciate that. And please check out Ronan's work. It is very good. He's an international man, an Australian who lived in Zimbabwe. Now he's in Czech Republic, done all over, many more places, I'm sure, Ronan, London, among others. But great work. I really appreciate your time to come on and chat with me today. Thanks very much, man.
No, thanks very much for having me, Jay. It was a great chat. I really enjoyed it.
Cool. Me too. All right.